On a morning that no press release describes and no official statement from the Pentagon has acknowledged, the most consequential maritime encirclement in the post-Cold War era quietly completed itself around an island of 23 million people. Not warships. Not the gray hulls of the People's Liberation Army Navy that satellite imagery tracks and Western analysts model and congressional testimony references in declassified threat assessments. What surrounded Taiwan on that morning was something that those threat assessment frameworks were not built to see, something that operates in the space between war and peace that international law has never adequately defined, and something that the United States government, with all of its surveillance capability and all of its alliance relationships and all of its decades of accumulated intelligence on Chinese military operations, is finding extraordinarily difficult to respond to, because responding to it would require acknowledging it publicly. And the Pentagon has chosen silence. That silence is the story. Because the United States does not go silent about Chinese military provocations around Taiwan. It issues statements. It summons ambassadors. It flies B-52s through the region to demonstrate commitment. It conducts freedom of navigation operations and holds press conferences and publishes declassified intelligence assessments designed to communicate resolve. The silence means that what surrounds Taiwan right now is something the Pentagon does not yet know how to talk about without triggering consequences it is not yet ready to manage. It means that the strategic framework the United States has used to maintain stability in the Taiwan Strait for 50 years is confronting a challenge it was not designed to address. And it means that Beijing has found, after 30 years of studying American deterrence doctrine and American political constraints and American institutional responses, the specific seam in the armor of American power projection in the Pacific, where pressure can be applied without triggering the response that American power projection is designed to produce. China's secret fleet surrounds Taiwan. The Pentagon is silent, and the island between them is facing a form of strategic pressure that the world has not seen before and does not have a name for yet. Stay with me. Because understanding what China has built, how it built it without the international community fully recognizing what was being assembled, and what it means for the island at the center of the most consequential strategic competition of the 21st century requires understanding a story that begins not with warships, but with fishing boats. And not with military strategy, but with something that looks, until you understand it properly, like ordinary commerce. To understand China's secret fleet, you first need to understand the strategic problem that China's leadership identified in 1996 and has been solving systematically and patiently for the 28 years since. In March of 1996, the People's Liberation Army conducted a series of missile tests in the waters around Taiwan in an attempt to intimidate the island's population before its first direct presidential election. The United States responded by sailing 2 carrier battle groups, the USS Independence and the USS Nimitz, through the Taiwan Strait. The message was direct, unmistakable, and operationally humiliating for China. Beijing could threaten Taiwan with missiles, but it could not prevent the United States from physically inserting itself between the threat and the target, and it had no instrument capable of challenging the carriers once they arrived. For Jiang Zemin and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, watching those carrier battle groups maneuver in waters they regarded as China's sovereign concern, the 1996 crisis produced a strategic conclusion that has organized Chinese military development ever since. The conclusion was not that China needed to match American carrier power. That would take decades and might never be achievable at acceptable cost. The conclusion was that China needed to make the operational environment in which those carriers operated so hostile, so surveilled, and so subject to Chinese influence at every level, military, economic, legal, psychological, that the decision to sail them into that environment would carry costs that American political leadership would ultimately conclude were unacceptable. The military dimension of this strategy, the DF-21D carrier killer missiles, the submarine expansion, the anti-satellite weapons, the integrated air defense architecture, has received extensive analysis in Western policy publications. It is well understood and outlined, if not in all its operational specifics. What is less well understood, because it was designed specifically to be less well understood, is the non-military dimension of the same strategy. The dimension that operates through vessels that do not carry weapons in the conventional sense, that are crewed by men who are not uniformed military personnel, that operate under the legal cover of activities that no international convention prohibits, and that collectively perform military functions: surveillance, positioning, supply logistics, communications relay, and the physical occupation of maritime space, that the People's Liberation Army Navy could not perform with warships without triggering the international response that gray zone operations are specifically designed to avoid. This is China's maritime militia. And what is assembled around Taiwan in the pattern that the Pentagon is finding so difficult to address publicly is not a random collection of fishing vessels. It is the deployment of a coherent, coordinated, command and controlled maritime force that China has been building, training, funding, and operationally testing for 15 years, at a scale and with a sophistication that the international community has chronically underestimated because it does not fit neatly into the categories through which Western strategic thinking processes military threats. The maritime militia is not a metaphor. It is not a loose affiliation of patriotic fishermen who occasionally assist the Coast Guard. It is a formally organized component of China's national defense architecture, funded through the People's Liberation Army's budget, commanded through the PLA's chain of command, crewed by personnel who receive military training and military compensation, and equipped with military-grade communications and surveillance systems that their fishing boat exteriors are specifically designed to conceal. The RAND Corporation's 2023 assessment of China's maritime militia, the most comprehensive unclassified analysis produced by any Western research institution, estimated the militia's active strength at between 100,000 and 150,000 personnel organized into units across China's 3 maritime regions. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, in a separate assessment published in late 2024, estimated the number of vessels equipped for militia operations at between 3,000 and 5,000, a maritime force larger than the combined naval fleets of most of the world's nations, operating under civilian cover in international waters every day. What is assembled around Taiwan is not a deployment from this force. It is the deployment of its most capable, most thoroughly prepared, and most operationally significant component. The specific units that have been rehearsing the Taiwan mission specifically, in exercises that Western intelligence has been tracking with increasing alarm for the past 3 years. Now let me show you the operational architecture of what surrounds Taiwan, because the specific positioning, the specific capabilities, and the specific coordination between the militia vessels and the PLA Navy and Coast Guard elements that are operating alongside them reveals a strategic design of a sophistication that the term secret fleet only partially captures. The positioning follows what Chinese military strategists call the 3-layer encirclement doctrine, a concept that appears in PLA military publications that have been translated and analyzed by the Office of Net Assessment inside the Pentagon and by the China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. The doctrine specifies 3 concentric rings of maritime presence around a target area, each performing distinct functions and each providing mutual support to the others. The outer ring operates at ranges between 200 and 400 kilometers from Taiwan's coastline, in international waters, beyond any legal basis for interdiction, performing continuous surveillance of the maritime approaches that any American naval force would need to transit to reach Taiwan. The vessels in the outer ring are equipped with over-the-horizon radar systems, acoustic sensors designed for submarine detection, and satellite communication terminals that relay their observations in real time to the PLA Eastern Theater Command's Maritime Operations Center. They look like fishing vessels. They are, functionally, a picket line of sensor platforms that provides China with early warning of any naval movement toward Taiwan that would begin hours or days before any American intervention could arrive. The middle ring operates between 50 and 200 kilometers from Taiwan's coastline, in waters that include Taiwan's exclusive economic zone, but remain outside its territorial waters. This ring is composed of a mixture of maritime militia vessels, China Coast Guard cutters, and PLA Navy surface vessels operating in what Chinese naval doctrine describes as a normalized presence pattern, a continuous rotation of vessels that maintains the physical presence without the specific provocative acts that would trigger legal responses. The middle ring's function is dual. It performs additional surveillance with shorter range, higher resolution systems, and it establishes the physical precedent of Chinese presence in waters that China intends, through the accumulation of that presence, to assert as a zone of Chinese operational authority regardless of what international law specifies. The inner ring is the most operationally significant and the most carefully concealed from international observation. It operates within Taiwan's contiguous zone, waters between 12 and 24 nautical miles from Taiwan's coastline, using vessels that maintain positioning consistent with fishing operations while carrying out functions that are anything but. The inner ring vessels carry specialized communications equipment that monitors Taiwan's military radio traffic. They carry underwater sensor arrays that map Taiwan's submarine detection capability, providing China with real-time intelligence about the gaps in Taiwan's acoustic monitoring coverage through which Chinese submarines could approach undetected. And they maintain positions that, in a conflict scenario, would provide forward observation posts for the initial phases of a military operation, giving Chinese planners real-time ground truth about Taiwan's coastal defense dispositions at the moment of maximum relevance. This architecture has been assembling incrementally over a period of months, not in a single dramatic deployment that would trigger alarm. In the pattern of gradual normalization that China has used in the South China Sea, each vessel addition individually justifiable as commercial activity, the cumulative effect being a transformation of the operational environment that only becomes visible when the full pattern is assessed, rather than any individual vessel's activity. The American intelligence community has been watching the pattern assemble. That is not in question. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's satellite coverage of the Western Pacific includes the approaches to Taiwan with a frequency and resolution that captures vessel movements at the level of individual craft. The NSA's signals intelligence collection tracks the communications architecture that coordinates the militia fleet with sufficient fidelity to distinguish between genuine fishing operations and coordinated military activity. The Office of Naval Intelligence has been producing assessments of the militia's Taiwan-focused operations for at least 2 years that have been distributed to senior policymakers with increasing levels of alarm. The Pentagon knows what surrounds Taiwan. The question the Pentagon cannot answer publicly is what to do about it in a manner that does not accelerate the confrontation it is trying to manage. Let me give you the numbers, because in this case, the scale of what has assembled is itself the strategic argument, and the numbers make that argument more clearly than any analysis. The current deployment around Taiwan, based on the synthesis of commercial satellite imagery analysis published by the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, signals intelligence reporting described in outline by officials who have spoken to Reuters and the Financial Times, and direct observation by Taiwan's Coast Guard and Navy that has been shared through liaison channels with the United States and Japan, consists of the following. Between 240 and 280 maritime militia vessels occupying the outer and middle ring positions. These vessels are drawn from the fishing fleets of Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong provinces, the 3 provinces whose maritime militia units have been specifically identified in PLA documents as assigned to Taiwan contingency operations. Their presence is continuous, maintained through a rotation system that brings fresh vessels from Chinese ports as others return for resupply. At any given moment, the 240 to 280 vessels on station represent approximately 1/3 of the total militia force assigned to the Taiwan mission, with the remainder in various stages of standby readiness. Between 45 and 60 China Coast Guard vessels operating in the middle ring in a pattern that CCG commanders describe publicly as routine law enforcement and maritime sovereignty patrols. The vessels include the CCG's newest and largest units. The 10,000-ton type 055B cutters that are larger than many nations' destroyers and carry water cannons, deck guns, and communication systems that are militarily equivalent to what the PLA Navy deploys on its smaller surface combatants. The CCG operates under the Maritime Police Law enacted in 2021, which explicitly authorizes the use of weapons against foreign vessels in waters that China claims, including the waters around Taiwan. Between 20 and 25 PLA Navy surface vessels operating in loose coordination with the outer ring, maintaining positions that fall within their internationally recognized rights of navigation while establishing a 4th layer of military presence that provides the entire deployment with credible military backing. These vessels include Type 052D guided missile destroyers, Type 054A frigates, and, most significantly, Type 022 missile boats whose small size and high speed make them optimal for the coastal interdiction role that a Taiwan contingency scenario would require. Beneath the surface, in positions that Taiwan's acoustic detection systems have been unable to consistently track, an estimated 3 to 5 PLA Navy submarines are maintaining patrol positions in the approaches to Taiwan's major ports. The submarine presence has been inferred from a combination of signals intelligence and the activation of Taiwan's P-3C Orion maritime patrol aircraft in patterns that indicate active ASW operations. The submarines have not been positively identified, or their exact positions confirmed by any publicly available source. Their probable presence is assessed from operational indicators rather than direct detection, which is precisely the operational effect that submarine deployments are designed to achieve. The total number of Chinese government-directed vessels in the waters around Taiwan at any given moment is therefore between 310 and 370, a figure that, if those vessels were flying naval ensigns rather than commercial flags, would constitute the largest naval encirclement of a contested territory since the Cuban Missile Crisis. They are not flying naval ensigns. That is the entire point, and that is why the Pentagon is silent. Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of the United States Indo-Pacific Command, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in March 2026 in terms that defense analysts immediately recognized as obliquely describing the militia deployment without naming it directly. He stated that China's activities in the waters around Taiwan had reached a level of sustained presence and operational coordination that represented a qualitative change from previous patterns, and that required new frameworks of analysis and response. He did not use the word encirclement. He did not describe the militia fleet in operational detail. The classification of the full intelligence picture prevented direct disclosure, and the policy implications of direct disclosure were not ones that the administration had yet resolved. The testimony, specific enough to alarm, general enough to avoid commitment, is the public face of the Pentagon's silence. Behind it is a policy debate of extraordinary urgency and difficulty. Now let me address the counterargument because serious analysts are making it, and it deserves a direct response. The counterargument has two components. The first is legal and definitional. Maritime militia vessels operating in international waters are not engaged in an act of war. They are not firing weapons. They are not boarding Taiwanese vessels. They are not physically preventing navigation. The international law of the sea does not prohibit the presence of large numbers of fishing vessels in international waters, regardless of whether those fishing vessels are performing military surveillance functions while anchored over traditional fishing grounds. By responding to the militia deployment as though it constitutes military aggression, does the United States not risk establishing precedents that constrain its own operations and its own allies' operations in waters where the presence of naval-adjacent civilian vessels is routine? The second component is escalatory. If the United States responds publicly and forcefully to the militia encirclement by deploying carrier strike groups explicitly in response, by naming the militia deployment as a military provocation, by providing Taiwan with the countermeasures that would allow it to physically disrupt the militia's surveillance activities, does it not risk triggering a Chinese response that escalates the situation beyond the gray zone into the domain of direct military confrontation, producing an outcome that is worse than the managed pressure of the current encirclement? Both components are serious. Neither constitutes an argument for accepting the strategic reality that the encirclement is producing on the legal and definitional component. The argument that because maritime militia operations do not violate the specific letter of international maritime law, they cannot constitute a military challenge that demands a military response, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of gray zone strategy. Gray zone operations are specifically designed to produce strategic effects while remaining within the technical thresholds of international law. The absence of a legal violation does not mean the absence of a strategic threat. The militia encirclement is systematically mapping Taiwan's defenses, demonstrating Chinese operational presence in waters adjacent to Taiwan, establishing the physical precedent for Chinese authority in those waters, and providing the forward positioning infrastructure for a military operation. All of these things are happening regardless of whether any individual vessel is doing anything that the international law of the sea prohibits. The relevant question is not whether the militia's activities are technically legal. The relevant question is what strategic reality they are producing. And the strategic reality they are producing is an operational environment around Taiwan that is increasingly dominated by Chinese presence, Chinese surveillance, and Chinese physical positioning, an environment that makes any future military option more difficult and more costly for Taiwan and its partners, regardless of what the legal status of the vessels creating that environment happens to be. On the escalatory component, the argument that responding to the encirclement risks triggering escalation that is worse than the current situation assumes that the current situation is stable. It is not stable. A maritime encirclement that is not responded to does not remain static. It expands, deepens, and normalizes. Each day that the militia vessels remain in position without consequence is a day that their presence becomes more accepted as normal, more difficult to challenge, without the challenge appearing disproportionate, and more embedded in the operational baseline that any future assessment of Taiwan's strategic situation must incorporate. The choice is not between responding to the encirclement and accepting stability. The choice is between responding now, when the encirclement is still incomplete and China's investment in it is still reversible, and responding later, when it is more complete, more normalized, and more costly to challenge. Every day of Pentagon silence is a day that the later response becomes more difficult and more dangerous than the earlier response would have been. But the implications of what surrounds Taiwan extend far beyond the immediate confrontation in the Taiwan Strait. Let me show you the full architecture of consequences, because the militia encirclement is not a standalone operation. It is one component of a broader strategic movement whose full dimensions are only becoming visible now. Begin with the Japanese dimension, because Japan's strategic exposure to what China has deployed around Taiwan is, in some respects, more immediate than America's. The Ryukyu Islands, the chain of Japanese islands that runs from Kyushu southward to within 110 kilometers of Taiwan, are the geographic frame through which any American military response to a Taiwan contingency would need to operate. The U.S. Marine Corps' newly configured Marine Littoral Regiments, stationed on Okinawa and training specifically for the island chain defense mission, represent the ground force component of a defensive architecture whose effectiveness depends on the ability to freely operate in the waters between the Ryukyu Islands and Taiwan. The militia's outer ring positions overlap with these waters, not provocatively, not in ways that technically interfere with Japanese or American navigation, but in ways that provide continuous surveillance of exactly the approaches and operating areas that American military planning for a Taiwan contingency requires. The militia vessels in these positions know what they are watching. The Indopacom analysts who track them know what they are watching. And both sides know that the other knows. Japan's response to the encirclement has been, by Japanese standards, unusually direct. The Japanese Ministry of Defense, in its 2026 Defense White Paper, a document that Japan uses with deliberate care to signal strategic concerns without triggering diplomatic confrontations, dedicated a section to what it described as China's use of non-military maritime assets for military purposes in waters adjacent to Japan's Southwest Island chain. The language is diplomatic. The meaning is not. Japan has named the militia, described its functions, and placed it in its Defense White Paper, a document whose every sentence is reviewed by the cabinet before publication. Prime Minister Ishiba, whose governing coalition has been navigating the difficult politics of Japan's constitutional constraints on military action while simultaneously accelerating the most significant Japanese defense buildup since the Second World War, authorized a specific operational response in the month following the encirclement's completion. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force's P-1 maritime patrol aircraft, Japan's domestically produced replacement for the P-3C Orion, began conducting systematic surveillance flights along the outer ring's positions at intervals and altitudes that make it clear their purpose is not routine patrol but specific observation of specific vessels. The flights are not acknowledged publicly. The militia vessels know they are being observed. That mutual knowledge of observation is itself a form of strategic communication. South Korea, whose official position has been to maintain a degree of distance from the Taiwan issue in deference to its economic relationship with China, has nonetheless made a specific procurement decision that reads clearly in the context of the encirclement. The Republic of Korea Navy's accelerated acquisition of additional P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, a program whose original timeline had the delivery of the additional aircraft in 2029 and which has now been moved to 2027, is not driven by the North Korean threat, against which the P-8's maritime patrol capability is not primarily relevant. It is driven by the assessment of South Korea's maritime security community that the operational environment in the Western Pacific is changing in ways that require enhanced maritime surveillance capability, regardless of where South Korea positions itself in the explicit Taiwan debate. The Philippines, which signed a mutual defense treaty with the United States in 1951 that obligates both parties to respond to armed attacks against either's armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific, has been confronting with increasing urgency the question of what its treaty obligations mean in the context of gray zone operations that are not clearly armed attacks, but are clearly directed at a strategic objective that affects Philippine security directly. President Marcos, whose government has been navigating the most difficult U.S.-China-Philippines triangular relationship in the country's post-colonial history, has made a series of decisions since the encirclement's completion that read as a coherent strategic response, even though no single decision has been publicly framed that way. The activation of 3 additional sites under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, specifically including a site on the Batanes Islands, the northernmost point of the Philippine archipelago, located 190 kilometers from Taiwan, provides American access to a geographic position directly relevant to any Taiwan contingency response. The decision was announced with language about strengthening Philippine defense capability. The strategic logic is considerably more specific. Now, look at the dimension that is ultimately the most consequential. The dimension that operates inside Taiwan itself, because the militia encirclement's most important effect may not be military, but psychological and political. Taiwan's population of 23 million has been living with the reality of Chinese military threat since 1949. The threat has been managed, normalized, and in some respects domesticated through 75 years of cross-strait coexistence that has produced deep economic integration alongside persistent political hostility. Taiwanese public opinion polls consistently show a population that wants to maintain the status quo, not formal independence, which would trigger military response, and not reunification, which an overwhelming majority opposes, but the ambiguous middle ground of a de facto separate existence that the current situation provides. The militia encirclement is designed to move that public opinion, not through military threat, which produces nationalist cohesion and has historically strengthened rather than weakened Taiwanese resistance, through the slow, accumulating, psychologically specific pressure of a population that can see, because Taiwan's government has been deliberately transparent about the militia's presence in ways designed to mobilize international attention, that their island is surrounded by Chinese government vessels in a pattern that has no precedent in the 75 years of cross-strait coexistence. The question that Beijing is asking through the encirclement is not military, it is political. It is a question directed at Taiwan's business community, which has enormous economic exposure to China, and whose political influence on Taiwan's government is substantial. It is directed at Taiwan's older generation, which has lived through the periods of greatest cross-strait tension and retains a visceral memory of what open conflict would cost. And it is directed at Taiwan's younger generation, which has grown up with a strong Taiwanese identity and strong democratic values, but which has also grown up watching China's military capability grow every year relative to the gap that Taiwan and its partners can credibly fill. The question is, at what point does the accumulated pressure of encirclement, of the demonstration of Chinese operational reach, of the evident difficulty that American deterrence has in responding to a challenge that operates below the threshold of what American deterrence was designed to address, at what point does that pressure produce a political shift in Taiwan toward accommodation rather than resistance? Beijing does not need military victory to achieve reunification. It needs political exhaustion. And the militia encirclement is a tool for producing political exhaustion in a population that military threat alone has consistently failed to exhaust. President Lai Ching-te, whose Democratic Progressive Party government has staked its political identity on resistance to Chinese pressure and deepening security ties with the United States and Japan, has responded to the encirclement with a combination of transparency and military signaling that reflects his government's assessment that the international community's engagement depends on making the nature of the threat visible. His government has briefed the media on the militia positions with a specificity that previous Taiwanese administrations avoided. It has published the coordinates of militia vessels in Taiwan's EEZ. It has shared surveillance imagery with allied governments through liaison channels. And it has made, through the Defense Ministry, a specific request to the United States for the provision of additional counter-surveillance capabilities that would allow Taiwan to monitor the inner rings activities with higher resolution and at lower cost than its current systems allow. The United States has not publicly responded to that request. The Pentagon is silent on that too. But the USS Theodore Roosevelt's current operating pattern in the Western Pacific, maintaining a position that is close enough to be relevant in a contingency and far enough to avoid the direct confrontation that the encirclement is designed to provoke, communicates something, not resolve, not commitment, something more ambiguous. The kind of strategic uncertainty that has historically served American deterrence, but which, in the context of an encirclement that gray zone strategy has been designed to exploit, may be less stabilizing than the clear signals that previous generations of American deterrence produced. Let me take you back to where we started. That morning, that maritime encirclement completed in the space between war and peace that international law has never adequately defined. That Pentagon silence that is louder than any statement the Pentagon could make. The men on those militia vessels know what they are doing. They have been trained for it, equipped for it, and deployed to do it by a command structure that extends from the individual vessel's commander through the PLA Eastern Theater Command to the Central Military Commission in Beijing, where Xi Jinping sits as commander-in-chief of an operation that is simultaneously a military deployment, a legal operation, an economic activity, a political pressure campaign, and a psychological warfare exercise. They are doing all of those things simultaneously, with 310 to 370 vessels every day in waters that the international community does not have a framework for addressing. Xi Jinping spent 30 years studying the 1996 lesson that the United States could insert military force between Chinese threat and Taiwanese target without China being able to prevent it. He spent those 30 years building the answer. The carrier killer missiles were part of the answer. The submarine expansion was part of the answer. The anti-satellite weapons were part of the answer. But the secret fleet, the maritime militia in its Taiwan encirclement configuration, may be the most elegant part of the answer, because it is the part that operates in the space where American deterrence has the most difficulty functioning. It does not give the United States a target it can engage without becoming the aggressor in the eyes of international opinion. It does not cross the red lines that American commitments to Taiwan are built around. It produces strategic effects. The surveillance of Taiwan's defenses, the physical presence in Taiwan's adjacent waters, the normalization of Chinese operational authority in those waters, the psychological and political pressure on Taiwan's population, while denying the United States the clean choice between deterrence and escalation that American strategic doctrine is designed to navigate. China's secret fleet surrounds Taiwan. The Pentagon is silent because the silence reflects a genuine policy problem whose resolution requires choices that American strategic culture, American political institutions, and American alliance relationships are not yet prepared to make. But the silence will not hold indefinitely because the encirclement will not remain static. It will expand. It will deepen. It will normalize. And with each day that it normalizes, the response that would have been proportionate yesterday becomes the provocation of today and the unimaginable escalation of tomorrow. The island is surrounded. The question is not whether that matters. The question is whether the people and the governments responsible for deciding what happens next will find the clarity to act while acting is still the proportionate response, or whether the accumulated silence of too many mornings like this one will make the choice for them by making every remaining option more dangerous than the one they failed to take today. China's secret fleet is real. Taiwan is surrounded, and the most powerful navy in human history is, for the moment, quiet. That moment will not last. But every moment it lasts changes what comes after it. Thank you for watching. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening in the waters around Taiwan, beyond the official statements and the diplomatic communiques and the Pentagon's carefully maintained silence, please like this video and share it. Because 23 million people on an island in the Western Pacific are facing a form of strategic pressure that the world has not named yet. And unnamed threats are the hardest to defend against. At TGN, we will continue to follow the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific with the precision and the honesty that the stakes demand. Because what happens in those waters will determine the shape of the century that follows.